and Kannada literature. So how it actually started from Tamil Nadu and how it shifted towards
Right.
Karnataka, and
Yeah.
the various important works of those times. So in the Tamil
Right.
literature, it started with the Sangam and Tolkapiyam, and then it
Yeah.
had the epic
And which
period.
period was that? Sangam and Tulkapiyam. Which period was that? You are right, absolutely right.
I think it was in third century before Christ or something like that. I'm
Right,
not sure.
right, right. From third century to around first century after Christ, we have this period called Sangam period, right? Okay, and we discussed Tolkapia, right? So, what do you remember about Tolkapia? What is it?
It's a
Anyone?
grammar of the Tamil language and culture.
Exactly, very good. And it also has something else. You are right. It contains something else as well. Who remembers that? No one remembers? Bhargavi, do you remember?
Sir, I just joined the call. Could you repeat
Yeah,
it?
so what I was saying that what did we discuss last time? And Pizza and Bhavya told me that we discussed, we started, after completing Kabir, we started discussing Kannada Bhakti with Basavanna. But before that, we discussed historical and cultural context. And Pizza says that we discussed a bit about Tolkapiyam, which is text towards later part of Sangam period, third century to first century AD. And she says that it consists of grammar, right? Tamil grammar. So it's one of the earliest books on grammar ever in history, right? If you'll compare it with English, then maybe English dictionary is 18th century, Samuel Johnson. So almost 2000 years before Samuel Johnson, Tamil had a full-fledged dictionary grammar of Tamil language. But it has something else as well. That's what I asked. So who remembers Maitreyi? Anyone? Dharma?
So is it the sutras?
Yes, it is in sutra format, right? That is the genre. I mean, sutra is a kind of aphorisms, a kind of epigrammatic writings, which summarize earlier texts. So, an example of sutra literature, apart from Tolkapiyam, is Brahma Sutra, right? Which is a compilation of aphorisms about the nature of Brahma and drawn from Upanishads and other philosophical texts, Vedic texts. But it's presented in sutra format. Then you can also, if you remember, Yoga Sutra is also another very important sutra genre. It's a sutra text of Patanjali. So Tolkapiyam is also in that sutra format. But what is it about apart from grammar? That was the question. Yeah, Stuti?
Sir, I just wanted to ask, the sutra format is the one that is taken from the Vedas and Upanishads, or is it the Brahma Sutra? Like,
Sutra is not taken from Upanishads or Vedic. It is a independent
Brahma
genre.
Sutra
It's
is
a kind
based
of,
on.
yeah, it's a compilation of various propositions and statements in a concise form. Right.
Okay.
So Yoga Sutra means it's a series of propositions on yoga by Patanjali. Brahma Sutra is series of propositions on Brahma or ultimate reality. So Tolkappiyam is also in that genre. But apart from being grammar of Tamil, as Fiza said, it has something else as well. Yes, and what is that? Bhargavi, Akkam and Puram. Yes, Bhavya, Buddhist philosophers also had sutras of all kinds, yeah. And they chant these sutras, yes. It is a genre, right? So even Buddhist philosophers would write sutra. Yes. And they have also their own mantras. So what they chant is usually mantras rather than sutras.
Sir, you discussed Akam and Puram like the genres of classic Tamil poetry, and then
Right.
you discussed them in like Silapatti Karam, I guess. Akam dealt with that which is inside or the inner world. We discussed the themes of
Akkam
them.
and Puram are two ideas and genres in Tolkappiyam, right? And these are literary genres. They classify existing Sangam literature, which was mostly about love and war, right? So they were called poems of love and war by people like A.K. Ramanujan. And these poems were usually divided into two kinds of conventions. One was Akam, which means internal world, inner world, and usually consisting of love, right? And outer world or Puram, which was largely about war, politics, about courts, and all those things. So they had two kinds of poems, one describing love and one describing affairs of men, usually wars, right? So these were the Shangam genres. And by the time you reach epic period, that is Seelapattikaram and Mani Mekalai. These are two very famous epics. Seelapattikaram by, I think, Irango Article is one of the great epics in Tamil. And both these epics are deeply influenced by Jainism and Buddhism, which became a predominant strand and predominant paradigm of, of philosophy in Tamil literature. So there is a substantial influence of Jainism and Buddhism on these epics, right? And what else after this? What did we discuss?
Sir, we also discussed this one female poet, Andal.
And in what context did we discuss her?
Sir, the poems of divine love and her contribution towards the Bhakti movement that emanated from the Tamil land in the
Right.
6th century.
Right. So then we started discussing Bhakti, and one of the important poets, as Bhargavi points out, is Antal. And the Tamil Bhakti movement was bifurcated into two important sects. One was the Saiva sect, the worshippers of Shiva, and the others were the worshippers of Vishnu and the Vaishnava sects, right? And what is interesting here, that Tamil literature, which was largely secular, then became Jain and Buddhist. And then it became Vaishnava and Shaiva. So Aryanization or acceptance of assimilation of Sanskrit happened in Tamil literature. But all this assimilation did not happen at the cost of Tamil, Tamilness. Yes, somebody raised his hand here and I didn't see.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, can you repeat this whole thing once again?
Which thing?
About
About what happened after the epic? Huh?
about Jainism and Buddhism and
Yeah, these were the major influences in Tamil literature before Bhakti, right? So Bhakti period is something like 7th, 8th, 9th century. And the classical Tamil period, it goes back to 3rd century to 6th century, where you have these two important epics, Mani Mekalai and Silpattikaram. And yeah, huh? Bolo. Just 1 minute. Yeah. Uh, so we were discussing the history of Tamil literature, right? So after Sankam period in 1st century AD, till 3rd to 6th, we have the epic period, which is influenced by Jainism and Buddhism substantially. And we have these two epics, great epics, Mani Mekalai and Silpattikaram. So the place of what Ramayana and Mahabharata is in North India, you will find that this is a similar place these epics have in Tamil cultural life. Right? Such is the importance of these epics. Then comes the Bhakti, where you find two predominant sects arising, Sampradaya. And one Sampradaya is the Vaishnava Sampradaya, which forms around handful of saints called Alvars, right? And the Shaiva Sampradaya, which was called Nayanars. So Nayanars and Alvars are the two important panth of Tamil Bhakti. And Andal was a very important poet of the Alvar tradition, Vaishnava Bhakti poetry, right? And she anticipates many of the things that Meera would write almost 4 centuries after Andal, like conceiving of devotion as a kind of erotic union with the divine, right? Or considering God as your lover and as your husband. And many Alvars saints like Nam Alvars and others. Alvars means those who are submerged in water. So that is about Tamil Bhakti. And by the time we come to Antal, there is an emergence of Kannada literature, right? and it starts with a text on poetics called Kavi Rajmarg, right? So while text on poetics in Tamil is Tolkappiyam, many centuries later in Kannada you have a text on poetics. Yes, Kalabras were the rulers who were also Buddhists and Jains, but they were not disliked by Tamils. They were seen as outside invaders who disrupted Tamil life. Bhargavi, Kalabras, right?
Yes, sir. I just
Yeah,
remember the historical context we're discussing of who was ruling, like when the Sangam period was going on.
right. And these two important texts of poetics. In Tamil, you have Tolkappiyar, and in Kannada, you have Kavi Rajmarg by Sripati. Kavi Rajmarg absorbs or assimilates many of the ideas from Sanskrit, but at the same time, it also innovates and asserts its Kannada-ness. So compared to Tolkappiyar, Kannada literature was far more open to Sanskrit influences, and we see the difference between the two. So by 11th and 12th century, you have in Kannada, you have a movement called the Veer Shaivas, right? Veer Shaivas were the devotees of Shaivas or Shiva, and some of them were also called the Lingayats. Lingayat is probably, in my understanding, a larger panth, and Veer Shaiva is probably a kind of development within that, and it is heralded by Basavanna, whom we are studying. And it is very aggressive against outward rituals and Varna pride and all those things, in some way anticipating Kabir by 3 centuries, almost 3-4 centuries again. So Basavanna and Basaveshwar movement, as it is called, is a very important development in Kannada literature and is beginning of Kannada Bhakti, right? So we started looking at those poems one after another, translated by A.K. Ramanujan. And the genre that they are using, the great Kannada Shaiva poets, is Vachana, right? Vachana is saying something, but in prose. So while metrical chants and verses or metrical songs seem to be very important part of other bhakti, Vachanas are typical prose sayings, right? And they are translated into English by a very renowned English poet and translator and scholar called A.K. Ramanujan, right? And that is what we are studying. And we started reading some of the poems. Does anyone remember anything about those poems? Specific poems that we studied? We discussed a couple of poems, right?
So one was about how humans don't really know that they are being that they are coming to the end of their lives as well. Just and this was in comparison to another creature, but I don't remember which one it was. Um but like we
That was another great poet called Dasimaya, and
yes.
this is the poem. Can you see this? Dasimaya says that if they say breast and long hair coming, they call it woman. If beard and whiskers, they call it man. But look, the self that hovers in between is neither man nor woman. O Ramnath. That is a vachan by Dasi Maya. Right? So it's not about.
I was talking about another poem though.
Okay.
Not this one.
Which
Sir,
one?
one that she's talking about is the first one about the snake charmer.
Yes. No, this one.
Yes.
The last poem that we discussed. Right, by Basavanna. Look here, dear fellow, I wear these men's clothes only for you. Sometimes I'm man, sometimes I'm woman. O Lord of the meeting rivers, I will make war for you, but I will be your devotee's bride. That is a vachan by uh, Basavanna. So, and you can see that the whole rigidity about genders is not something that bhakti upholds, right? Just like because after all, gender and sexuality has something to do with body, and body is seen as something that is temporary and which will die, be reduced to dust, rather than the soul. So we discussed some of these poems, right? We discussed this poem, The Sacrificial Lamb, right? Brought for the festival, ate of the green leaf brought for the decoration. Not knowing a thing about the kill, it only wants to fill its belly. Born that day to die that day. But tell me, did the killer survive, O Lord of meeting rivers? Right? And we usually take pride in the fact that, look, we are butchering that goat or lamb, and it does not know it's going to die, it's well fed. But Basavanna asks that do the killers also know that they are going to be killed? They are also going to be butchered, right? One day. And it was about the question of mortality and ignorance, right? So in some way, Basavanna is implying that even the killers who commit these kind of things don't know about their own mortality. So what do you have to say about this?
So this poem we
Just
discussed
that
would no, go ahead.
Yeah, but we'll go ahead, then we will have the next one.
So when we discussed this particular poem about the lamb, sacrificial lamb, we got to know that the it's not just about the lamb. It's about the people itself and their own sense of mortality. How we all are the universal lamb to slaughter. I remember from that discussion this like we're all eating and living like there's no tomorrow. We're all living in today, but tomorrow no one knows what's going to happen. So at large, everyone is going to get executed. That only.
Right. That is true. About uh, intimations of mortality and about the knowledge of death, right? So even if human beings have knowledge of death, they don't really live that way, right? That is what. So in some way, his human life is not very different from animal life. That's the state from which he says we should come out. And then we also discussed this temple poem. Does anyone remember? The rich will make temple for Shiva. What shall I, a poor man, do? My legs are pillars, the body the shrine, the head a couple of gold. Listen, O Lord of meeting rivers. Things standing shall fall, but the moving shall ever stay. What do you make of this?
So it's not the action of building temples, but internalizing the concept of bhakti. How you your devotion from within, and not what you build outside, because that
Right.
would perish. But what is within you will stay with you
Right.
as long as you live.
Right, and they made a distinction between sthavar and a jangam. So Veersaiva sages or holy people are called jangamas very often. Right, jangam means moving, mobile. So they conceive of themselves as mobile temples, and that cannot be destroyed. Only the temple that is standing can be destroyed. Right. Incidentally, those who follow contemporary news, current affairs, may be aware of very powerful section of Kannada society called the Lingayats, right? And they are very politically influential, and they have their holy people. There was a controversy regarding whether they are part of Hinduism or not. And one of the governments in Karnataka also passed a bill saying that if these people don't want to accept Hinduism as their religion, they are free to do so. But that did not turn out. Right. And most of the political leaders in Karnataka, especially the chief ministers, the current one and the one before, are Lingayats. They come from Lingayat community. They are big landowners, big farmers, very influential caste. So here is a sampradaya turning into a kind of caste, right? Which is very interesting. Not always does it happen that a panth or sampradaya becomes a caste. So this is just for the current affairs, and people who want to rule over Karnataka, any political party will needs the support of Lingayats. So they are that powerful. Okay. Bhargavi says non-dualism. Yes, exactly. We discussed the Advait as important philosophical perspective in Bhakti, in Kabir as well as in Veer Saivas. I ask you if there are any Kannadigas in the class. Does anyone know Kannada? To which I think no one says anything. Okay. Later on, A.K. Ramanujan goes on to give a theory of what is Bhakti, right? And he says that Bhakti is something like counter structure to two main traditions of India. The two main traditions in India are Margiya traditions, or that those traditions which are cross-regional, not limited to specific region. And those traditions can be Sanskrit traditions, cosmopolitan traditions as they are called. They are also called great traditions. While there are local systems of belief and local poetics and aesthetics, folk, all that is called Desi. So Margiya and Desi. Desi means of a particular desh. Margiya is about the way. That's how music is also classified in India. And A.K. Ramanujan goes on to say that Bhakti, especially in this tradition of here, can you see this page? Can you see this page here on your screen?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
So according to A.K. Ramanujan, Bhakti is a kind of personal religion, right? Which stands against the entire system, right? And the system consists of great tradition whose main texts are Vedas or Vedic rituals and caste hierarchy and mythologies of Shaiva and Vaishnava kind, pan-Indian mythologies. The little traditions are based on the local Purana, Sthala Purana as they are called. They perform local sacrifices, etc. And their organization is of local sects and cults. And their deities are also local. Very often these two great and little tradition converge and form a new kind of religious figure. And we discuss, if you remember, the god called Murugan, who was one of the regional deities of Tamil Nadu, right? Then he became identified with a larger Shaiva divinity called Kartikeya and Skanda, brother of Ganesha, right? And that's how Murugan became Skanda. So mythology of pan-Indian kind and regional kinds come together, converge very often. Now, according to A.K. Ramanujan, Bhakti is protest of all these traditions. That is his theory, something that I personally don't agree with, but this is his theory. Any questions about this system of Hinduism as he lays it out? No questions? This public and personal again is a problem because Bhakti very often used to be very collective affair, means singing and chanting and dancing often takes on a collective kind of dimensions in Bhakti. It was never like my problem with A.K. Ramanujan is that he is looking at it from very westernized categories at Bhakti. And it's not very historically accurate. But anyway, this is his idea. And he goes on to point out that Veerasaivas were protesters not against the Hinduism of their time, but also against Jainism, the powerful competitor to Hinduism. Basavanas and Dasamaya's life were a desperate struggle against both Brahminism and Jainism. And yet, with Jainism and Buddhism, they also shared the doctrine of ahimsa. Okay. Now, this is about the genre, Vachana form. Can you see this page?
Yes, sir.
And he says that Vachana form and the oral poetics of Vachana are not similar to Sanskrit Shruti and Smruti traditions, right? Shruti, as we have been discussing, is the tradition of Vedic corpus, and Smruti is Itihas and Puran traditions, including Mahakavyas, right? Vachan is their own genre. And though medieval Kannada was rich in native Dravidian meters, remember Kannada, Tamil, Telugu and Malayalam are languages of Dravidian origin. They are not derived from Europe, Indo-Aryan or Indo-European languages like Punjabi, Gujarati, Marathi, Bengali, Hindi and so on. So this is how Basavana puts it. I don't know anything like time beats and meter, nor the arithmetic of strings and drums. I don't know the count of iambic and dactyl. My Lord of the meeting river says, nothing will hurt you, I will sing of love. I will sing as I love. So if you see that he is breaking the conventions of worshipping the God. He says that I don't know anything about tal and music and meters and prosody. I will sing as I love because it won't hurt you. And this is also one of his another Vachana. He tells God, make of my body the beam of a lute, of my head the sounding gourd, of my nerves the strings, and my fingers the plucking rods. Clutch me close and I play your 32 songs, O Lord of the meeting river. What do you make of this poem? Lord of the meeting rivers or Kudala Sangama is Shiva in the form of meeting rivers. So all these vachanas are addressed to Shiva, right? Who is worshipped in form of Kudala Sangama Deva. So you might be wondering. So make of my body the beam of a lute, of my head the sounding gourd, of my nerves the strings, of my fingers the plucking rods. Clutch me close and play your 32 songs, O Lord of meeting river. What do you understand by this poem? Anyone wants to comment? What do you understand?
That it's not even the poet himself singing all of the songs. It's God himself singing through him. He is
Very
literally devotion through and through.
right. He is almost the embodiment of the divine voice, right? But he is asking
Yeah.
God to make his body the musical instrument, right? So that you can play your songs on me. So here is a little history of bhakti, which Ramanujan just revises. Right? He says that Bhakti Saivism knit far away Kashmir with South India because Kashmir had its own variety of Saivism, which was different from South Indian variation, right? And then you find Bhakti spreading over in the form of Ramananda, right? Who was the disciple of Ramanujacharya, who is supposed to have gone to the north, and probably Kabir was his disciple. So then it spread all over India, from Tamil Nadu to Kannada to Marathi, Gujarati, Hindi, Bengali, Assamia, Punjabi, roughly in that order. Like a lit fuse, the passion of bhakti seemed to spread from region to region, from century to century, quickening the religious impulse. And here it talks about from Upanishads onward, large number of similes and analogies have been pressed into service. So great number of bhakti literature draws upon this reservoir of metaphors and similes, like the seed and the tree, the sea and the river, the spider and the self-woven web, the thread and the gems, the warp and the woof, the river and the boat, the chariot and the charioteer, the king and his subject, the child and its fantasies, the stage and acting, the puppet and puppeteers, the dream, the dance and the sport of Leela. So all these images and metaphors were used in bhakti. And you can see this in Mahadevi Akka. She says, like a silkworm weaving her house with love from her marrow and dying in her body's thread, winding tight, round and round I burn, desiring what the heart desires. Cut through, O Lord, cut through, O Lord, my heart's greed and show me way out, your way out, O Lord, white as jasmine. So what is she saying here? Can you analyze this?
So her body and her heart is burning with desire, and she's asking her God to show her a way out and liberate her.
Right. So she feels trapped in her own desires, right? Like a
Yes.
silkworm weaving her, like silkworm is in her cocoon. So she wants to break out of the cocoon which she has spun, and that is of her heart's desire. So uh, she calls upon God to cut that greed in her heart and lust in her heart and break out of that cocoon. So you can see the metaphor. Okay, then Ramanujan goes on to discuss various structures of Vachan, right? The master of the house, is he at home or isn't he? Grass on the threshold, dirt in the house. The master of the house, is he at home or isn't he? Lies in the body, lust in the heart. No, the master of house is not at home. Our Lord of the meeting reverse, says Basavanna. Right? So what do you make of these poems as students of literature who have studied mostly, right, English poetry in your schools and colleges, and some of Hindi literature, which you have studied, some of you may have studied. What do you make of this South Indian poetic tradition? What is your response to it? What do you feel about it?
So it expresses a deeply personal connection with God.
Right. So what is your response to such poetry? No response.
Sir, I'm not exactly sure if this is the meaning, but could it be like Basavanna is trying to tell us that the master of the house, the God, is not at home, but
No.
he's everywhere?
Yeah.
He is
Yeah.
everywhere, in the grass of the threshold, dirt of the house, in the body, and the lust in the heart.
Yes, and that's why master is not at home, he's saying.
Yes,
घर पे
so
कोई
our
नहीं है.
gods are everywhere.
Because lies in the body, lust in the heart. That's the dirt, right? The master cannot be at home when there are lies in the body and lust in the heart. So purity of heart is a must, so that the master of the house. So who is the master of the house?
Shiva, the Lord of the Meeting Universe.
Yeah, the god, Kudal Deva Sangama, right? Kudal Sangama Deva, sorry. Uh, that is the god. So God cannot live in the house which has this. So my question was not about specifically this poem, but I am asking you about in general, what is your response to this literature and cultural history of South India that we discussed? What do you think about it?
So, general opinion or in contrast
In
with the
general, what
Western?
is your, yeah, I am interested in your response to it. How do you look at it?
But to me, this seems like, again, as I had said earlier, the heavy basis of religion and the involvement in it. And it's not just religion, it's a very personalized form of religion between the uh, believer, between the person who is religious and their God. In this case, the Lord of the two meeting rivers, as you said. And the poems are they have a very natural element to it. They pick on things that are available in the environment just like that. And the metaphors and these things are very much reliant on uh, the practices and the kind of world these people were in at that time, especially the sacrificial lamb one. Not many people would be able to associate that in the Western literature with religion, especially the pagan after the paganism ended post Old English period. So this
Yeah.
is one of my observations regarding these particular
Yeah, no,
poetries.
that is absolutely perfect. But what do you feel and think about it now that about what you have perceived?
So
Correct.
as far as the feeling goes, it kind of feels familiar for some reasons I cannot really explain in depth like that, because when you bhakti tradition is something that has been an understanding of my own idea about religion since a very long time. And I think most of the children also perceive religion like that only. They do not really get into the details, but it's just about that deep connection with the God. Apart from that, also the philosophical values that's in this system is brilliant, especially the universal lamb to the slaughter. Again, I'll come back to that because that is one particular poem that I very much liked,
Right.
and it was really thoughtful of putting something in that manner, and it really showed the kind of literary pedigree people had at that time, especially this particular poet. And so that's part of my personal opinion. I'd have to read a little bit more to understand it better and formulate an even better bond. Like towards Kabir, there is still rather better understanding of mine compared to the South Indian traditions of poetic literature in the medieval period of India.
Right. So you are able to relate to certain parts of its religiosity, right? Which is intensely personal, and the simplicity of its expression regarding the elements that it finds around it. So how does it compare to English poetry that you have studied from school onwards? How does it compare with that?
The
And this is for all of you, not just Bhavya. This conversation is meant for all. Yeah,
yes,
Bhavya.
sir. The as far as the poetry that I have studied, the major genres of poetry and the major subject matter. First of all, poetry has been associated with love, the idea of passion. Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poem comes to my mind. Second,
Hmm.
the kind of things that we have studied are more contemporary. relating to the world wars, the first and the second poems by Wilfred Owen and Edwin Brock. And if we go back into a little bit into the history, the medieval poem, especially if we are comparing eras as well, then we can look at the Canterbury Tales. And these are vastly different. Canterbury Tales had a more social satiric quality to it. It was a commentary on the society of that time without being too obvious about it, picking up people from different sections of the society. Now, this here is, it would be an understatement to say generalized, but it has a universality to it from my point of view, because they not only talk about philosophical values, but also what God means to people who cannot build temples. So the discussion goes from society. It's also in society, like up until now, how we read Kabir and his commentary on religion and his take on religion was also there. But the philosophy behind it, the idea behind it is profound. That's the only word I have for it. It's very, very deep. It's a very deep understanding of. I do not know if I can say uh, metaphysics, but I think that would be a wrong word to use right now. But still really think that it's deeply philosophical, with enriched with meanings that can only be taken when one understands the social context and the world beyond the physical form, which is something that I have yet to see in English literature, especially at this level with this kind of painting.
Very true. Anyone else wants to say something about how do you relate to English literature and Kabir and Basavanna? What's your take? How do you relate to this? What's your observation? Apart from Bhavya, anyone else has to say something? Fiza, Maitreyi, Dharma, yeah, Stuti, go ahead. Yeah, Stuti.
Um, so it seems like I don't think English literature is that much lacking in profoundness as compared to Indian literature. But looking from a religious point of view, it feels like English poetry is much it's not as religious as Indian literature is. But I can feel the depth of those poems when those poets also talk about love. Now most of the times that is romantic love between two partners maybe, or a or poems about self love, accepting yourself, all of that. Uh, so it's I think at the end of the day, most of the poets are talking about this longing to be one with with something greater, with something more, something bigger than us. So that is something that we find, that I have found in most languages, in most regions, geographically, everywhere. It's there. In not just in India, all over the world. Like some translations that I've read also, they all so many of them talk about love and union and all of that. So yeah.
So you find that there is a typical depth, particular kind of depth that bhakti poetry of Kabir and Basavanna have. that is of metaphysical, spiritual, religious kind, which you don't find so pervasive in English, you mean? It's more about worldliness, secular love, secular world that seems to be the focus of English poetry. Yeah, first Bhargavi and then Dharma.
Sir, I also agree with what you just said, and I just wanted to add that when it comes to like the poems that we have read, they all the poets, even though they are challenging the socio-cultural norms and conventions, the way they are being rebellious is through a philosophical lens. They are questioning the sense of being, the sense of self that different religions and different people follow.
Very,
So
from a
that's a
metaphysical
very,
and spiritual angle from which they are rebelling, right?
yes, sir.
Yeah.
They are not directly rebelling, which we see these direct rebellions in the English poets.
Mm-hmm.
And these
Well, this is done from a philosophical and spiritual lens, as you correctly pointed out.
yes, sir. These concepts we see in Western philosophers, but not poets mostly. That's what I mean.
Hmm. So the distinction between philosophy, poetry is also, and religion, which
Yes.
seems to be made in the Western literary and cultural tradition, does not exist here. Your religion, philosophy, literature, all the three converge,
Yes, sir.
right?
The interconnected, yes.
Hmm. Very, very true. Yeah. Dharma, what do you have to say?
Yes, sir. I think one of the biggest reasons why the English poets, they talk about self-love and romantic love and all those things, but why we don't see all those things in Indian literature is because the idea of self is at question, and that uh, you know that makes everything different when we see it Indian literature, because when uh, the English poets talk about romantic love and all those things, they clearly have this understanding that you are different and the other person is different. But when it comes to Indian literature, there is a completely different perspective to it. So it takes a whole new shape of its own.
You are right, but not very accurate when you say that there is no depiction of worldly love in Indian literatures. Because if you look at Sangam literature, Akam and Puram talks about everyday world of war and love, where there is no this. You don't find this metaphysical desire uh, to transcend differences that you find in bhakti, right? You find that as a physical love that is being suggested. Similar things that you find in many of Sanskrit poems as well, where physical love is given a lot of importance, and the text like Kam Sutra, right, would emphasize the physical dimensions of pleasure and sex, right? So it's not that physical love does not exist in Indian literatures. It does, but the texts that you are studying are emphatic about, uh, as you rightly point out, self and the other distinction, because because use idea of Advaita does not accept this distinction between self and the other, because God is both self and other, right? So this whole Advaita metaphysical thought seems to be undergirding bhakti eroticism. So even if bhaktas talk about erotic love or gender, it's not merely about physicality, right? Which they want to almost transcend. That is what we find. So you are partially correct. Yeah. What would
Yes,
you
sir.
say?
Yes,
Yeah.
sir. I agree. And a
And
better
what you say
statement.
about self completely is valid for bhakti, right? Especially. But if you look at, say, for example, Mudra that we discuss is wholly secular, right? It's all about power. and manipulation and strategies and intrigues. So it is about artha and about power, while bhakti is about transcending this world of differences. Right. So there are various aspects to Indian literatures which are complex. Right. Okay. Yeah,
Yes.
Bhavya, what were you saying?
So I just wanted to point out that most of these differences, I think, between the Western and the and Indian literature, especially in the medieval sense, is that the religion there played a huge part with politics, and not just in governing the lives of people, but also oppressing them, which cannot actually be translated in Indian literature like that. Religion has always been that important part, but it was not pervasive like that, so that it
Yeah.
would identify what kind of what sort of things you would do. Of course, we do have the Varna system, but after a certain point of time, things changed a little bit. And the religion has always been this deep rooted. Every single decision taken in this particular landmass has been based on one way or another with religion most of the times.
Yeah,
And
and not
the
just that,
caste,
even thinking about what we mean by religion is also very different.
yes, sir.
Dharma and religion are not equivalents,
Yes,
right?
sir. And there's also this prevalent caste system. So while the
Right.
Western poets and authors at one point of time were open to say anything about religion, because religion and state became two different matters after one point of time. Especially if we look at what King Henry the Eighth did when he wanted to divorce his wife. He
So we will look at
brought
this whole
about
question
another
of
church.
secularization and modernity
Yes,
when
sir.
we start looking at the colonial period in the next unit that we'll take up about the process of modernization in India. Right. So we'll discuss all this at length. So you can hold on to some of these ideas that you are putting out. Yes, someone else wanted to say something. Who was it? Okay. Hmm. Divyang, you had to say something? You wanted to say something about this? Okay. But how many of you found this exposure to ancient and medieval Indian literature interesting? Uh, yes. Bhavya, Bhargavi, Fiza, Stuti, Harshita, Maitreyi, Dharma. Okay. How many of you cannot understand what's happening in the class? You can say so. We can sort it out, right? In case you're feeling lost, or if you have doubts, or if you have queries, then we can look into it. There is no problem in that. Okay. Stuti, you have to say something?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, even right now when you said about who is feeling lost about it, I think it does get a little overwhelming sometimes because of the vastness of all of it and how old all of these things are and how much
Yes.
bigger the history is as compared to
Yes.
English literature. Because in
Exactly.
English literature, it's like if you read chapters 1 from 6 of the paragraph book, you would get a very clear idea of what the history of English has been like. But Indian literature is much, much older and much
Older and
uh,
complex.
much more complex.
Diverse, right?
Yes, yes. So it makes it much more complicated.
That becomes overwhelming. I agree with you. It's also overwhelming for me, right? So much of information, background information that I give out, and that's completely incompatible to history of English literature that you are studying from SY. Very different traditions of literature, very different traditions of knowledge, very different traditions of politics as well, right? And metaphysics. So this very difference, diversity, and antiquity means you are talking of Tolkappiyam, which is poetics of the time of Aristotle almost, right? Some centuries after Aristotle also, which people are still following in Tamil. The classical Tamil is different from vernacular Tamil that is used today or modern Tamil. But at the same time, there is a kind of continuity of that language. Just like modern Greek is different from classical Greek, or modern Italian language varies from classical Latin, or even modern Latin is different from classical Latin, right? So given this, while Latin is just an ecclesiastical language of scholarship, Tamil is still language that people speak in spite of fundamental changes in its structure. Even then, right? It's a spoken language that is used today. It's a living language used by crores of people. So you can see the continuities as well, right? Unlike Sanskrit, which has status similar to Latin and Greek of being an elite language, right? Largely in spiritual and religious domains that you use it, Tamil is still spoken by people. So you see very different kinds of traditions in India, and which are mind-boggling. Plus, even in schools and colleges, you are not exposed to all this. Means in your school, question of literature would begin with Hindi Bhakti. You might have heard of Kabir and Rahim and Tulsidas, and there it gets over, right? Mirabai. But nobody talks of South Indian Bhakti, because, and that is the origin of it, right? Okay, so we stop here for today and we'll continue our conversations tomorrow, right? We'll look at Mahadevi Akka in a bit of greater detail tomorrow, along with some poems of Basamanna. And I will also give you the poems that we have discussed in Kabir. Yeah, I'll put that in the group, right? So see you tomorrow. Yeah, and take care.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.